We gather today at a consequential moment in history, a moment when it seems that democracy itself is under assault. We see this around the world. We see this in Ukraine. We see this in Iran, where the people's aspirations for a free and democratic Iran are inconsistent with the regime's convictions. And we see it in authoritarian regimes around the world. But it's not at all surprising, because for 40 years, this movement, the People's Mujahideen movement, has been the principal focus of the regime's attention. And we know that the fact that, once again, the opposition movement finds itself in the regime's crosshairs is a sign that the opposition is ascendant. It's on the rise, and it poses an existential danger to the regime in Tehran. You know, as a scholar, I can tell you that one academic study several years ago found that the MEK and the NCRI have received more attention from the regime than all other opposition movements combined. We've long known that within authoritarian regimes, they fear internal pressure more than external threat. And this is all for good reason, that the regime is as concerned as it is with the People's Mujahideen movement. For decades, the resistance has stood for justice and democracy, gender equality and human rights, and a non-nuclear, non-threatening, non-belligerent secular state. A secular state that is at peace with regional and Western powers and at peace with the world. In the United States, we've seen supporters of this movement, Democrats and Republicans, liberals and conservatives, current and former officials sanctioned by the regime, 61 in all, including 31 sitting members of Congress. We need to be very, very clear. We will not be intimidated. The world will not be intimidated. We are not frightened, and we will continue to draw courage and strength and try to live up to the high example that has been set by the opposition movement. As a scholar of the Iranian resistance, I can tell you that I believe we are indeed on the brink of change in Iran. And so I'm so pleased to be here with my colleagues to join them in conversation today, to unpack a series of issues. And my hope is that in the future, I will not be studying the opposition movement in Albania or in France, but that I'll have an opportunity to study the implementation of the ideals that the opposition stands for in a free and democratic Iran. And I'm hopeful that in the future, when we engage in broadcast together, we'll have an opportunity to gather in Tehran. Ambassador Blackwell, I know that you have been a friend of the Iranian resistance for some time, and your distinguished career in American politics gives you a unique perspective on the valuable role that they play in creating democracy in Iran. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about how you became involved and how it is that you became familiar with this opposition movement, and what role you think that they play in building a free and democracy-loving new country.
As a teenager and as a young adult, I was luckily and faithfully involved in the civil rights movement in the United States. And I was able to witness firsthand the irrepressible quest for freedom and human dignity. And one of the things that the leadership of that movement, including the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, gave us to think about was the universality of human rights. And it became very clear to me at a tender age that not one government on the face of the earth can give you your human rights. The obligation of governments are to respect your individual liberties and human rights, which are given by a higher authority. And so what we witnessed was that history is not a snapshot. History is a process. And there are times for choosing, just like many of the folks in Iran are choosing now. You can choose to influence and make history, or you can choose to be made by history. And the regime in Iran wants individuals, both inside Iran and outside Iran, to turn a blind eye to their brutality and the carnage that they have left within Iran. We are speaking out. We are inspired by those folks in Iran that understand that evil loves darkness, but that we all have been, in our human dignity, embedded with a light. And now is the time for choosing, both inside Iran and outside. Do we speak up, speak out, and affect change? Or do we cower? And I'm so inspired by the courage that I see within the resistance and the diaspora across the world, but most importantly, by the courage of folks, young and old, inside of Iran.
You know, I work with students semester to semester who are very often looking for inspiration, and they look historically to figures like Martin Luther King. But I encourage them, like you, to look for examples that are contemporaneous of people living up to these same convictions. And I remind them that one of the things that Dr. King really believed at his core is that structures are made up of the repetitive acts of individual agents. Structures exist because we allow them to exist. And if we want to remove structures that are unjust, all we need to do is encourage individuals to engage in new repetitive actions. And this requires organizing, and it requires calling out the darkness when we see it, and then seeking to remove injustice. And it sounds like you're inspired by those same convictions.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Foreign Minister Baird, how did you become involved in these issues? And what kind of perspective do you have in looking at the threats posed by Iran from Canada?
Well, I was inspired by my grandfather, who at age 22 went to Europe to fight in the Second World War, and then stayed in the Canadian Armed Forces for 25 years after the war. The great struggles of his generation were first fascism. Well, the great struggle of our generation is the threat posed by international terrorism. And you see this, the mullahs in Tehran and the terrorism they promote, whether it's at a community center in Buenos Aires or Chabad House in India, whether it's the terrorism that they promote throughout the region. This is a huge threat to humanity and to civil society. But really the worst terrorism that the Iranian regime in Tehran promote is the terrorism within, whether it's the example of the huge atrocities committed in 1988, or whether it's the terrorism they inflict in every region of the country against the resistance of people wanting to stand up for human dignity, for democracy, for human rights. And I think it's incumbent upon us to stand with them. When I was foreign minister, we wanted to first call out this regime, not just for its nuclear program and its abysmal and deteriorating human rights record, but also its promoting havoc everywhere in the region. And at some point we had to not just speak, but take a stand. So when I was foreign minister, Canada kicked out all of the diplomats, the regime's diplomats in Canada. We withdrew all of ours, broke off diplomatic relations, and said we've got to step up our game. And that's why I'm here today. I'm inspired by the resistance units showing great courage, great determination, and I want to work with like-minded people to promote regime change from within Iran for this terribly destructive force and see an Iran that will be living in peace and security with its neighbors, economically prosperous, and where all people will be treated with dignity and respect.
Wonderful. Ambassador Blackwell, you were recently listed alongside a number of other prominent Americans on a list prepared by Iran's foreign ministry of sanctioned individuals. I wonder what your reaction was to that listing. You know, I have many colleagues who also were listed, and they see this as a great badge of honor, a great badge of distinction. In Washington, I've heard that being named to this list is almost akin to receiving an Academy Award. I wonder what your reaction was to this listing.
Well, as you mentioned earlier, and as I said to the assembled, dogs don't bark at parked cars. That was something my father told me. He talked to me about the risk of leadership in doing the right thing. And so the fact that the regime's leaders in Iran has put me on this list means that I've taken a step in the right direction, because the barking dogs of totalitarianism, authoritarianism, they know that I am part of a freedom movement across the globe, but more importantly, they know that I'm committed to inspiring those within Iran to continue to push for change and democracy, and to push to make sure that this brutality, this reign of brutality, is defeated, and it will be. And the reason that the dogs are barking is because they know it will be defeated.
You know, one of the things I tell my students each semester is that the best antidote to misinformation and disinformation is more information. Ideally more accurate information, but ultimately more information. You know, we just had an opportunity to tour a really extraordinary museum. I was here in 2019 and I saw some of the early exhibits, and I was impressed then, deeply impressed as an academic. But I can tell you that having just toured the museum again, I was even more impressed today by what I saw. And I think what I really see in walking around the exhibits is an effort to shine a spotlight on the evidence, the facts, all of the information. And I benefited today from having a tour guide who didn't try to trump things up, just simply acknowledged what it was that really happened. I wonder if you could, both of you, tell me and us a little bit about what you saw and what you'll take away from having toured that extraordinary set of exhibits next door.
You know, in Cincinnati, we have the Freedom Center, which is an institution that talks about the human struggle through the civil rights movement. I've visited the Holocaust museums, and you become instantly aware of the capability of folks to do evil. And so as we have chronicled the evil acts of the regime in Iran, what gives me hope, and I hope that it fires hope in the hearts and spirits of folks inside Iran, is that we saw that these regimes, these productive shops of evil, are now on the ash bin of history. And that's where this regime will be.
I think what they're doing at the museum is documenting the atrocities that this regime has committed, and obviously commemorating their souls, but also hopefully to inspire not just members of the National Council of Resistance, not just to inspire all of us who saw the exhibit, but to hopefully shine a light on the courage and the bravery that people have given in their pursuit of human dignity, in their pursuit of peace and human rights. It's really inspiring. I mean, the regime might have thought by trying to instigate a terrorist attack would somehow have people back off and go away. Well, they failed. They're only shining the light on how evil that regime is, and inspiring people like all of us to look at their bravery and to speak up and to take action against the regime.
It's so interesting you say that. You know, I've been working now on the Iranian resistance and studying them for some 15 years. And one of the first historical individuals that I encountered was Professor Kazem Rajvi and their kind of reverence for him. And I still today find him to be a fascinating figure. But I also just think it's interesting that a political movement held up the value of a professor. As a professor myself, maybe I just took some kind of interest in that. But it took me a while to realize why he was so important. And I think it was because they understood that a professor's job is to seek the truth, to seek evidence, to work with facts, and to ask questions. Fast forward in time, another individual who I worked closely with, the former president of the Iran Policy Committee, an individual who I think has probably appeared on panels with both of you, is Professor Raymond Tanter, an individual who spent 37 years on the faculty at the University of Michigan and pursued a distinguished career in higher education. And then I would count amongst the scholarly supporters of this group an individual like Ambassador Lincoln Bloomfield Jr., a former Assistant Secretary of State and an individual who served in 5 American administrations. Ambassador Bloomfield has undertaken some of, I think, the best academic studies on the People's Mujahideen of Iran movement. So what I take away from the exhibits and the museum is exactly what you do, Minister Baird, this overarching interest in the evidence, the truth, and this unshakable conviction that if enough light is shown in the darkness.
The truth, I'll tell you, will set the Iranian people free. I think I'm inspired. If you want to have a civil society, if you want freedom and a prosperous economy, you got to have a central role women play in every aspect of society. I'm inspired by 2 women.
Yes.
One, there was a Iranian photojournalist, Madame Kazemi, who was brutally killed by the regime over a decade ago. And the indignity that her family had to suffer, where they cremated her body so there could be no evidence of the crime that the regime has committed. That may have, the regime might have thought they were getting away with it, but I'll tell you, the ambassadors were immediately recalled, and the Canadian public recoiled at the horror of this brutal regime. I'm also inspired by Madame Rajvi, and I'll tell you, I was inspired by the bravery she exercises every single day when she gets out of bed to fight for freedom of her people. So that the truth, documenting the truth, and spreading the real story of this regime is important. Especially those people who have the courage on the ground every day to fight for freedom in every region of Iran. They're an inspiration.
Yeah, and let me pick up on the courage, because in the face of oppression, it takes courage. And I go back to my study of the slavery system in America in its earlier years, and as I read the case studies by leading academics who have studied that period, they talk about the institution's objective of breaking the human spirit and taking from that individual, taking away from that individual a risk orientation, where that individual is willing to take a risk for freedom, as opposed to just giving in and living by the definitions, of the oppressor. Well, what we know is what's happening inside Iran and what's happening within the diaspora and the human rights community that's even broader, is that people are encouraged by individuals inside who are willing to take the risk for freedom. Mm-hmm. There was a legendary baseball player who used to say, it is very difficult to steal second base if you want to keep 1 foot on first. Mm-hmm. You know, that at some point you have to take the risk for freedom, and you want to, and break and take the break, and challenge a stale status quo, and that's what I see happening all across Iran now, in the face of a more intense hammer. They are in fact pushing back even more.
There's such extraordinary repression in Iran, and
that brings extraordinary courage from the resistance, which is very inspiring. I agree.
Absolutely. And the misogyny that we see from the Iran and the suppression of women in particular, I think is a problem that needs to be resolved. But I too am deeply inspired by the example set by Madame Rajvi in inspiring young women that there can be a brighter future and a different future. In fact,
Mrs. Rajvi understands the power of example. Mm-hmm. And so it's one thing to talk about leadership. It's another thing to actually lead by example. Mm-hmm. And so I frame my remarks, and I try to frame the way I look at oppressive situations like that administered by the regime in Iran. It's a time for choosing. Mm-hmm. Are we ready to take the risk for freedom? Mm-hmm. And again, I'm inspired not only by her example, mm-hmm. but by the individual Iranians mm-hmm. who are in fact inside the belly of the beast, mm-hmm. are ready to take that risk. And that's inspirational. And it's contagious.
I got a question period in Canada in the House of Commons after President Rouhani was elected. And they said, shouldn't Canada be working with this new president? He's a moderate. He's been democratically elected by his people. And I said, well, in response, I said, well, let's end this notion that he's a moderate. Let's end this notion that he's anything but a despot. And let's end this notion that it was anything like a fair election. Supplementary question comes up. Well, it was a fair election. How can you not say it wasn't? And I stood up and shamed the parliamentarian, asked me the question saying, Canada will never accept a democratic election, as big of a sham as it is, when you don't allow women to put their name on the ballot. And I'll tell you, that got me a standing ovation in the Canadian Parliament.
Yeah.
And we saw thousands of examples of individuals in Iran unfurling banners and saying, we must resist this tyranny. And I wonder if you have thoughts on the role that these resistance units are having in Iran. It's really quite extraordinary, the work that they're doing inside Iran. You know, for many years, I think the opposition movement was criticized falsely for being an exiled opposition movement, as if it didn't have an intricate network of support inside Iran. And what we do know now is that across the country, they have an intricate network of support. And in fact, they even have organized resistance units that are seeking to inspire women, inspire young people, and inspire hope in a brighter future.
What the resistance units inside are inspiring is that, again, in the framework of a time for choosing, individuals inside Iran can choose to be on the front lines or on the sidelines. But again, history is a process. You either act to influence it or you're acted upon by it, and therefore what's inspiring about the opposition units inside is that they have in fact signaled across the country that there are more and more people choosing to be on the front lines of this battle.
You could read history and be inspired by a Rosa Parks, one person, ordinary person, who did an extraordinary thing. You can be inspired by Dr. King and what he did. I'm inspired not by one resistance unit, and I think of the courage that each and every one of them is displaying at great danger to themselves and their family. And it inspires me, and I think it's going to inspire millions outside of Iran. It's going to inspire millions inside Iran, and I just salute their courage and say we are with you. We are fighting outside against this regime to support you.
So how does the world get behind this movement? What can be done to support and expand the good work that's being done by these resistance units and the opposition in exile? How do we encourage Canadians and encourage Americans to become kind of more involved in this issue and see that there is this alternative, that the status quo is not a foregone conclusion, but that regime change is a feasible path forward?
Well, we have to keep in front of folks the interrelatedness of things. You know, if that regime gets stronger, if their brutality is not challenged, they in fact will continue to be problematic for folks outside of Iran, whether it's in the energy sphere, whether it is in terms of international or in global terrorism. And so we all have a stake in making sure that Iran is a democratic, bottoms-up democracy.
Well, we got to stand up and speak out against this regime and its despotic actions. But speaking up isn't enough. So the work being done outside the country is extraordinary. We need to inspire those within Iran to continue to keep up the fight. And I'll tell you, when the regime begins to crumble, we need not just, frankly, Western democracies like Canada, the United States, or Western Europe. We need to inspire the Sunni Arab world and the Middle East. We need to inspire good and honest, decent people in every corner of the world to stand up and support regime change when the people of Iran are rising up. They're rising up. The regime is on its weakest point in 40 years. And we've got to be there. As this regime crumbles, we've got to be there giving it tangible support.
I heard you say, both of you, that the regime is at its weakest point in the past 40 years. And I believe that to be true. You know, the regime continues to be deeply concerned with this opposition movement. And as I said, they should be. So I wonder if there are other topics that you all would like to speak about today.
Well, I think we've sort of covered the waterfront. There's an old Marine saying, we don't retreat, we just attack from a different direction. That should be brought into the awareness of the regime. We don't retreat. We don't put anything in reverse. We're just going to come at this at a different direction.
Well, if I could speak to people inside Iran, there is a better day on the horizon. Iran has an incredibly educated population. It has a huge abundance of natural resources to provide wealth for the people. The Iranian economy will boom when freedom arrives. We will get rid of a government that's not just corrupt, but incompetent. We've seen that, whether it's the way they dealt with the COVID-19 global pandemic, whether it's the way they take literally tens of billions of dollars stealing from the people of Iran to promote terrorism and a misguided nuclear program. We are so close to a brighter future, and the free world, every country who has been targeted by this regime, whether it's the Sunni Arab Gulf, whether it's countries in every corner of the earth, will be there to help rebuild a new, prosperous, free Iran. The day is coming. It will come sooner than people think, and when it happens, it will happen quickly.
We can, we must, we will make sure that we're a part of that mix of humanity that ushers in, at the leadership of the Iranian people, a new and free Iran.
You know, I opened by saying that democracy itself was under assault around the world, but I am hopeful after this conversation, and I have never been more hopeful that democracy in Iran is in good hands, and I believe we are on the brink of change. This has been a very enjoyable conversation today with my dear colleagues, Ambassador Blackwell and Foreign Minister Baird. I thank them for joining me, and we hope you enjoyed the conversation as much as we did. Thank you, gentlemen.
Good to be with you, sir.